Oh. Hey there, everyone. We just got things started here. It looks like we have about 65 people live. So thank you so much. We appreciate you taking this time out in your day. My name is Bridget Danner, and this is Anne Moline, and we work together in Women's Wellness Collaborative. And right now we're in our enrollment period for our program that we do together called Restore Your Radiance. So as a little intro to the program and how we work, we wanted to present today two real labs from one client, one person, and how they work together. And Anne is mostly going to be touring you through those because she's our clinician. Yeah, and I am just going to be here to make I hope things run smoothly. Anne's in Vermont. Her internet isn't always super reliable. So if it gets a little choppy, please just bear with us. We probably won't lose her, and she can always come back on. So just please be patient with us. And there's a chat here on the right. We probably won't take questions much like during her presentation, but we can take some after. And what else is that? I was going to mention that, this is not a lab training for practitioners presentation. So this is to show you kind of how we work in our program within the bounds of your program. We're not here to sign you up for lab testing accounts or anything like that. So if you are a practitioner, I know we have many of those on our list. I definitely hope it's helpful for you, but this is not necessarily a training. So just keep that in mind. Anything else you want to add, Anne? Or?
I don't think so. Hopefully I'll stay here and in connection with you all. So
yeah, Karen, we will have a replay. I basically always have a replay, and I don't limit how long people can watch it for. And just because sharing documents always seems to be like a headache, we're just going to share them on the screen. So you'll see them on the video. If you watch the replay, you won't see the chat, but you'll see the documents we're talking about. And you can always sign up for our Restore Your Radiance program. You sign up for your initial case review at bridgetdanner.com. It's under the shop tab. So if you feel like you're missing some things because you can't see the chat later, just go to bridgetdanner.com, and I'll try to put also on your replay email any links that you might need. All right. Well, Anne, do you want to present the case or the concept a little bit before we look at the actual labs?
Yeah, so I think we're going to look at a couple of labs today that running a lot with a lot of clients. And, we had, Bridget and I were having a little chat. We recorded for a podcast the other day and talking about some of the themes that have come up during our work with a lot of these women we've been working with. And those themes kind of being hormones, thyroid, gut, right, detoxification too, a little bit, right? So kind of seeing these patterns. And so this is a really good glimpse at a couple of the labs that we're running a lot of the time. And she says it's cutting out a lot.
It's okay. I can hear you.
Karen, that's cutting out? Okay.
I can hear you. So just everyone can unfortunately technology is not 100% foolproof. So just be patient with. Okay.
So we're just going to look at a couple of labs from one client, and there are a couple of interesting things I thought about this case in particular and why I picked them, and some things we might not usually see. So this client's about 42 years old, and she's gone into sort of an early menopause. So her last period was in spring of last year, and they'd been somewhat intermittent before that, but it's definitely an early menopause. There isn't really precedent for that in her family. Both her mother and her grandmother went through menopause at normal age, actually even in due. So it seemed like there are some other contributing factors to all of this. She's also experienced a lot of fatigue, has had a lot of stress, has had some toxic exposure, particularly to she had some foam insulation that was installed in her house directly, and it was off-gassing a lot. And she really recognized that as a turning point in some of her symptoms and her health problems. Kind of a lifetime of constipation and struggles with that. She's
Poor
got 3 young
digestion,
daughters.
right? Like got full and bloated very easily, right?
Yeah, and had kind of adopted a vegetarian diet, trying to manage some of that, but so really heavy on grains and fruits and sugars and that kind of thing. You know, and I mean, I think one of the things that I always like to say, I totally understand why people take on vegetarian diets, and I'm not opposed to it for many reasons. But there are ways in which, if you're going to do that, you have to be really conscientious, especially if you have gut issues, about how you manage your diet and what you can and can't eat. And sometimes you have to be a little bit flexible about that if possible. So it can be really challenging, because this is a woman who has, we'll see as we go through, a lot of serious GI issues going on. And she's sort of feeding the beast with a lot of her foods that she was choosing to eat. Yeah.
Good point with the sugars and the, okay, interesting.
Yeah, and grain, you know, a lot of grains. She was really heavily focused on grains, fruits, sugars, and definitely has sugar cravings and a sweet tooth and all of that too. So
yeah, I just kind of wanted to sum up, because I remember when she first came to us, some things that might be relatable. Well, she was wondering why her period had gone and would it come back, which is interesting, you know. As I'm learning about women's health, like a lot of times our period problem is sort of like high up there, but it's often like not quite at the top, because usually something else is ahead of it, like being tired all the time. Like I think she was really struggling with, like, can't keep her thoughts together, feeling kind of anxious and overwhelmed, feeling bloated all the time, and like, oh, she's always full. And those are the things that are with you every day. Whereas your period doing something weird or not coming, it's not something that you think about like constantly. Yeah. So it's just an interesting observation I'm making over time about women's health. And also that when we go to clear up underlying factors that, and maybe not in this case, because this woman has not had her period in a long time, but often the female hormone things will clear up. I guess I should say, if you address it on time. So yeah, if you've already, you know, if you've gone into an early menopause, I see some people come out of, you know, a stopped period, but it's not often when it's been stopped for long enough, it won't come back.
Yeah. It can be really challenging anyway. So, and especially when, you know, in that, as you've transitioned into that early 40s, mid 40s age range, it can be really challenging to restore that. But, you know, there's still so much more. She's already got three children. So, she doesn't necessarily need to have any more kids.
True. Yeah.
You know,
she just wants her health back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's so much I think we can do on that front. So.
Okay, great. Well, you want to go ahead and share your screen and just let me know if you have any trouble with that.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my camera off first, and then I'm going to turn my screen on, and it's going to do this infinity room thing probably first, but and we'll get there. Okay.
It's coming.
All right. So are you seeing this hormone test up here?
Yeah, we can see it. Do you want to just introduce what the test is and how it works? And yeah, we run this on, did we run this on literally everyone, or?
All but one.
All but one out of 17. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, this is, it's called, you see the Dutch test, dried urine test for comprehensive hormones. It looks at, it's kind of like, if any of you have ever had any familiarity with adrenal saliva profiles, it's similar to that, but it's actually a lot more interesting and more nuanced and has several more markers. And so it looks at, as you can see, estrogen production, testosterone, sex production. It also looks at your stress hormones and adrenal gland hormone production, so cortisol and DHEA. And as we get down through more of the test report, you'll see it also shows you the breakdowns and metabolites of estrogens and testosterone and DHEA. And so you also get a window into not only the metabolites of estrogen, but how well estrogen's detoxifying. So you kind of see some phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. It looks at melatonin and let me see on this test. Oh, it does have it. Yeah, the oxidative stress marker. So that's kind of a newer marker on this test that was added in this past spring. So,
yeah, I'm just going to pause you 1 second. So there was a little wobble when you said showing estrogen reduction, progesterone production, testosterone, and then cortisol is just below. So I just want to say to people, if the audio is a little wobbly, you can see it on the screen. She's basically, so it was just a moment, Anne.
Okay.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah. So as we look at this particular client's test results, it makes sense, right? Even though she's only 42, that she's showing this purple band here represents that postmenopausal range for estrogen and progesterone. So it's kind of where we would expect a postmenopausal woman to be in this purple band. It's not where we would expect your average 42-year-old woman to be, but we do see this kind of reflecting exactly what we would expect for her given what she's presented with.
I want to, clarify the word premenopausal that you see across the top in the green range. That doesn't mean you're on the verge of menopause. It just means you are in your reproductive years. Is that right? You're in the reproductive range, we can call it.
Right. Yeah. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Yeah.
I just say that because it scares people a little bit to see that term.
Yep. If you're not in menopause, you're premenopausal or perimenopausal.
Yeah, even if you're 25, you're still premenopausal. So it's just a funny word.
Yeah. So then we also see, we would want her testosterone to be kind of more within this normal range. So we see that this is quite low. Low levels of testosterone will often result in fatigue, in some other things that she'd mentioned, which we didn't talk about, but like difficulty with stamina, like low difficulty putting on muscle, so low muscle density, right? So somebody who looks a little bit more wasting, or if you see somebody who's really, even if they're really lean, but if they're really cut, they usually will have more testosterone. So, we've got that going on. Overall, so the pattern here, as you can probably tell, whether or not you're versed in looking at any labs or not, is that there's depletion, right? I mean, we see her cortisol levels are really low when you're looking at cortisol. Free cortisol is your primary stress hormone. And free cortisol is the cortisol levels that are actually capable of acting at a cellular level, right? So that's the amount of cortisol that's capable of having some sort of function and responding to stress. Metabolized cortisol is the amount that you're actually producing and is overall a reflection of, metabolized means the amount of cortisol that you've metabolized through, but it's a reflection of total cortisol production more accurately than free cortisol. So free cortisol will change the body's activating and deactivating cortisol all the time based on needs and circumstances. But you can see overall, she's got very low production of cortisol and she's got cortisol. So when she enters into feeling overwhelmed, feeling stressed out, feeling like life is kind of too much, cortisol is kind of a hormone that helps you to get through your day, to face what you have to face and to have some resilience in the face of that. So we often think of cortisol as this harmful hormone, and it is catabolic when it's in excess, but we need enough of it to be able to respond to the stresses that we have day in and day out.
I'm just thinking of when I saw this client more recently, and she's certainly not finished yet, but she just presented so differently, with, how, she still has the same life, right?
Right.
Same number of kids, and she's just going along in stride easier. So it's nice to know that, I think, for our listeners and viewers, because I think I was in that state too, just feel like, well, I just have to cut out half the things in my life to feel well, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's so much that we can do. And some of that even is looking at, well, how do we respond to stress? So I'll just give an example from myself, because before we got on here, I actually have 2 internet providers because I deal with the situation of being in the middle of Vermont. But usually the stronger line was the one that was acting very unreliable. And I found myself getting so frustrated, and I had this impulse to throw the router across the room. It's like, either I'm going to throw the router across the room, or I'm going to like crumple up and cry or something, right? But then, it's like I've been working on myself for so long and developed so many tools for how do I deal with stress and what can I do? And I can just sit here and I can take some breaths, and I can not throw the router across the room. Just know, okay, it's all going to be what it is. And we all know sometimes there are technical challenges, and accept that that's just what we're up against right now here tonight. And there's not a whole lot I can do about it, right? So,
right.
Sometimes, and so there's that sort of attitudinal adjustment, but it's also come from doing a lot else to support my physical too, right? It was probably 10 years ago, I probably would have thrown the router across. It's like been that process. And one of the things I talk to clients all the time about is, okay, this client, her life is still the same, right? The stresses that she has in her unique situation with her kids and her lifestyle and all of that, that's all still there. But if we can reduce stress, other kinds of stress on the system, right? Whether that's food sensitivities, whether that's just making poor food choices, whether that's infections, whether that's reducing toxins in the environment, you suddenly bring down the overall load of stress so that you have more resilience in the face of the stressors that you can't do anything about, right? Those kind of day in, day out life stressors. So that's a lot of what I think about in the work that we do, is how to identify and work on some of those things so that people are more able to just face whatever life presents to them on a given day.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of good news, because there are things you can adjust and change. And yeah, I think if you're a woman listening, I think many women have been through it, just like, life is just way too much, and you feel like you're some days like on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Like, that's something. There's some things that could be reduced, yeah, like you said, in your gut health and your diet and like food sensitivities, so that to me that gives a lot of hope. It's also not just like a mental choice either. I talk about this on the podcast. We did a really fun example case on the podcast I just recorded. And yes, it makes you feel crazy to feel that way, but the diagnosis isn't crazy. Right. That's the result. Yeah. So also don't give in to thinking, well, I'm just a nervous wreck, I'm just an anxious person. No, that's not how nature intends you to be. So yeah, there are solutions.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I'll just also point out, so DHEA is also a really important hormone, primarily produced by the adrenal gland, but also some by sex organs, ovaries and testes in men. And this is kind of your resiliency hormone in some ways. I mean, cortisol is there to respond to stress. And when you think about some of the comments that are out there in the culture about cortisol being bad and it's destructive and it's catabolic, and that's all true. But if DHEA is in proper balance with cortisol, that's the hormone that helps you to repair and rebuild. And so it's okay to have sufficient amounts of cortisol that help you to respond to stress, as long as there's sufficient amounts of DHEA to counterbalance that and to keep this right. We have these things that happen, and our system is supposed to respond, and then it's supposed to recover, right? So in some cases, it's like the system's over responding and it's never recovering. And in this case, at the time when this test was run, this particular client wasn't really responding anymore. So that's when you kind of feel like that crumpled up state usually is when you just stopped responding.
So I'm just going to repeat what you said at the beginning because it was a little choppy. So DHEA is kind of precursor to sex hormones made in the adrenal glands and the sex glands to some extent. And then I think we heard the rest of it, which is it's okay to have cortisol doing its thing as long as DHEA, which is more reparative, and I don't know, I almost think of it as like the more feminine side of things. Like it's when we're in that state making DHEA, you know, we want to have sex and we want to play and we want to have fun. And cortisol is sort of like crisis, getting things taken care of, and keeping us going. And we do need a balance of those. I think we all can recognize that. And
right. Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the big takeaways from that comment for me too is just remembering like that balance is not about finding one static point, right? It's about finding a point, and then it's sort of like, I don't know, did you have one of those things when you were a kid where it was like a little board that you would try to balance on, and there was a sort of a little roller thing that would sit underneath the board in the middle? No, it was actually something you stood on.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, that the balance goes back and forth, right? And that's what happens in the body too. It's like something happens and the body responds, and that doesn't mean you're out of balance as long as the body can counter respond later on, right? And kind of keep that, it's like a pendulum in a way, as long as it's not going too far in either direction, but that you want it to be able to shift around a point rather than just remaining really static at a single point. That makes sense. I know that was weird.
Yeah,
if you don't know
great.
The little
going on tangents too. I'm good at that.
Okay, well, let's go down a little bit. I'm going to go down all the way to the third page where you can start seeing the metabolites. In this case, there's nothing all that, I guess, interesting to see necessarily, because the overall pattern is just towards depletion. We don't have very much estrogen at all. So as you start looking at the estrogen metabolites, it is a little bit askew for her. Typically, we would want to see a fair amount, a decent majority of the estrogen metabolizing down this protective pathway. And hers is kind of preferring this pathway over here, which isn't terrible. This is the more harmful pathway, this one with the red arrow coming down. So hers isn't awful, but there could be a shift in preference towards this more protective pathway. But her overall estrogen is so low that I'm not really worried about how it metabolizes, because there's not really enough for it to be harmful no matter what. If anything, I would want to boost her estrogen production a little bit. And then if it got high enough, I would have to start thinking about how to shift the metabolism so that it's favoring a protective pathway. But in her case, the story really continues to be one of depletion. We see the progesterones are all at that postmenopausal level. We do see her DHEAS. This is an interesting one because the overall DHEA that we saw, and we're just talking about on page 1, is actually a total of this DHEAS and the androsterone and the etioquinolone here. What we typically want to see is a favoring of DHEAS, because the S stands for sulfation, and that's one of the processes involved in detoxification. And we want to see that favored because that indicates good detoxification. So in her case, we see this, and this is an issue with her kind of again and again, is this poor detoxification element here. So we start to see some of that showing up in the way that this DHEA is reflecting here. And this is often, when sulfation is blocked, it's often due to inflammation. So
I know a lot of people are curious about their detoxification ability. I know there's a marker. You just showed us one with estrogen, and then there's another one further down on this page, I believe.
And hers actually, this one doesn't look bad. So methylation is the other one. And you will kind of want to see this gauge right middle of the dial, as hers is. But again, we have so little estrogen that we're working with. This is looking at phase 2 methylation of estrogen. And if there were more estrogen, it's questionable to me whether or not this would look as kind of on point as it does. I just think there's not enough estrogen for us to get a clear picture of that in her case. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe if time allows, Anne, you could share, this is one picture, right? This is not how everybody looks. Like, this is if you have PCOS and, overweight. It could be a much different picture. I think you've treated some clients with cancer. I'm not sure what you've seen on their picture. So, yeah, and I just want to emphasize it's not everyone's just low. It's just depends on the case.
This particular client, I could pull up a totally different looking result if you wanted. Though I don't know that I have one on hand that has all the client information.
Yeah. Just kind of want to mention, like, for instance, we saw testosterone being low, but sometimes we see that as being high, or, that kind of a thing. Androgens.
Yeah, even high estrogen. We have one client that has really high estrogen. And it's interesting because certain types of gut bacteria can drive estrogens to be high. So yeah, I mean, depending on the person, it can be very varied what you see. And what's even trickier is sometimes you get these clients who have, like in this case, we're seeing sometimes these metabolites, like, for example, in her case, if she had a whole bunch of estrogen, let's say this was 32 rather than 3.2, and it was favoring this pathway here, we would want to do something really quite different with her. And so then there are sometimes when things aren't balanced, right? So you could have, if this was sort of on the low end of the range, but then she had really poor metabolism of it, there's this balance between, okay, we want to shift the metabolism of estrogen. Often the things you do to do that down-regulate estrogen production, which we wouldn't want to do in that case, because if she was already on the low end. And so sometimes it gets tricky to kind of look at that and to figure out how to accomplish both things at the same time. But it's definitely doable. It's just, you have to look at all those different nuances of it. So.
Yeah, and I had someone just on the blog I wrote, said, well, how can I order a test? And this is why we don't just order tests, a la carte for people, because this is a lot of interesting information, and really you can't do anything with any of it if you don't have a practitioner guiding you through the subtleties of building a protocol based on all this.
Right. Yeah. The other things I want to point out with this client that I think are really important, I was actually surprised. So this is an oxidative stress marker, this one right here, and I'll just touch on that first. Oxidative stress usually occurs as a result of toxicity. So what it really means is that there's a lot of free radical activity. Okay, so, but it really is a reflection of toxicity, usually sort of carcinogenic. So cancer driving toxins, people who smoke will have really high levels of oxidative stress. People with really poor lifestyle habits, people who, let's say you had somebody who was working in like hair salons. That's a good one, right? Nail hair salons, stuff like that, where they're exposed to a lot of chemicals, will often have high levels of oxidative stress. So I expected in her case for this to be higher. But what's interesting is that melatonin is actually also an antioxidant. It's a hormone and an antioxidant. So we generally think of melatonin as a sleep hormone, and it does help with sleep, and we want sufficient amounts of it to be able to sleep well. But it's also a neuroprotective antioxidant. So what that means is that it protects the nervous system, it protects the brain. And she's not supplementing. So I would expect to see it high in somebody who is supplementing, but she wasn't. And so when I see melatonin starting to go high, I always wonder, why is the body doing this? What's it trying to adapt to? And in her case, my sense of it was, and especially since she was so able to link a lot of her, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back with her health to this off-gassing of this foam insulation that was put in, was that there were toxins that were probably neurotoxins that we're off gassing from that, and that her body is producing a lot of melatonin to try to respond to that and protect her from that, which is very adaptive, right? But it can also make you feel sleepy all the time because melatonin is a sleep hormone. So it would make sense with no cortisol or very low cortisol production, which gives you energy, with very low testosterone and DHEA and high melatonin, that she would be fatigued all the time. And this is, you know, the body doing something appropriate to the situation, but it's not making her feel well, right? So I thought that was a really fascinating result there.
Yeah, someone's having trouble with the screen. I'm seeing it fine. Maybe I'll open the chat. Anne, what page are you? You're on page 4 of 9.
I am on page 4, yes.
Okay. Yeah, again, guys, I'm sorry, we just don't maybe have the best internet connection, but I am seeing it scroll through. So sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say if you're having any trouble watching, you can just, you know, you can also listen. We're just kind of talking about, some people are saying I only see page 1. Okay, so did you have anything more to show on the Dutch? Because maybe I will show it instead.
No, go for it.
Okay.
I'll close mine out. I'll actually stop my screen share and let you do that part.
So it's not, somebody asked, it's not, we don't have a slide. So she just was scrolling through her screen. Yeah, and I apologize, guys, that there's poor reception. Frankly, it was either cancel it or just go for it. So I decided to go for it because we just don't have control of the internet where Anne is located. Anne, can you see my screen?
I can, yeah.
Okay. And can everyone else see my screen? I'm going to go. So just to recap, we did spend a lot of time on page 1, everybody. So, and then we just skipped page 2. And then we looked at page 3. So I apologize if you didn't see it. I was seeing it on my end as she went through, so I wasn't under the impression that other people weren't seeing it. So we looked at some of these markers, DHEA and DHEAS we talked about. We talked about these estrogen pathways, blue, green, and red. And we talked a little bit about this methylation marker on the end of page, I think we're on 3 here. And now we are on just the bottom of this page 4 in blue. So we talked about how melatonin was high and the oxidative damage wasn't looking too bad. But maybe that she still is facing some toxicity and damage that would make this antioxidant melatonin be higher.
Right.
So yeah, I do think we could send, because we've made this page anonymous, we could send it. Yeah, I probably didn't make I didn't send out the handouts because, but I actually could add them right now. So I'm going to add them. I think everybody's seeing my screen better than Anne's.
It looks like people are saying they're seeing it fine.
Okay.
So.
Okay, great. Sorry, everyone.
Thanks for the feedback, folks.
That's super frustrating. It's super frustrating. So often when I give a handout, people come late and then they're like, I don't have the handout. So I didn't want to create that stress, but maybe I should have in this case, because I was seeing her screen. I wasn't worried. So I could send out these. Perhaps we'll have to just make sure that they're, okay to send out and share. So we could perhaps send them out. You want to talk about this page at all, Anne, or are we kind of wrapped up on this one?
I think we're okay. Let's switch over to the GI map and talk about that.
Okay, so we're going to switch over to a stool test that we do run on most clients, and this will be a lot easier to read, and maybe, Anne, you can monitor the chat because I can't see it when I share. It should be easier to read and see, or if you can't see it, it's pretty straightforward, which is something I really like about this report. It's just yes or no, pretty much. There's some subtleties.
Yeah, there are some nuances to it.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm a pretty visual person, but I don't love results with like tons of flowcharts and stuff. So, okay. So maybe we can scroll down to our first positive here. Do you want to start there?
Okay. Yep. So we see this client has H. pylori, right? So we see that really clearly showing up high. The lab's flagging it as high. She has also this associated CAG-A virulence factor, which came out positive. So H. pylori is a bacteria infects the stomach, typically, commonly associated with things like ulcers, stomach ulcers, ulcers in the upper part of the small intestine. Commonly associated with like gastritis. There's even some relationship between H. pylori and development of gastric cancers and things like that over the long term. So particularly when there are these virulence factors, it becomes more potentially dangerous and damaging. So this is a big find for her. It's a trick too for a woman with a partner and 3 children, because it can be communicable to other people in the family, from other people in the family, right? So if, say her husband has it, he could keep giving it back to her even if she got rid of it. So it kind of becomes a family project sometimes. But it's a good find for her. And it's especially, it can definitely with those other symptoms of being bloated all the time, because H. pylori will decrease levels of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, which is responsible for helping with breakdown of protein. And if you don't break your proteins down well in the stomach, everything enters into the small intestine not really in the form that it should be, and kind of broken down to the form it should be. So that'll result in bloating, gas, poor digestion, poor absorption of nutrients. So
oh, I can't hear you for a minute, so I'll let you know when I can hear you again. There we go. I can hear you again.
Yeah. Okay. So then under the normal flora, I'm not worried about the Bacteroides one. That's okay. But we do see she has pretty low levels of lactobacillus, which is one of your more beneficial bacteria. So we have some bacteria that we want to grow and to be in abundance, and lactobacillus are some of those. I would call her bifidobacterium also low. The lab isn't flagging that, but to me, from looking at it from a functional kind of optimal range perspective, it's quite a bit lower than where I would want to see it. And your lactobacillus and your bifidobacteria strains are, you know, kind of 2 of the families of bacteria that are most beneficial and that you want in most abundance. So I would want to kind of coax those up a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. You say the bifidobacterium is, I mean, it looks by the numbers like it's way higher to me, to the naked eye, but I know you talked about those multiples on there. And then I'm just curious too, like, how did you come to decide or learn that you want a higher number than that?
Yeah, mostly through conjunction, you know, communication, cooperation with other practitioners, seeing hundreds of these labs and kind of correlating with people's health status and where people seem to feel well. Also, getting information from the lab too. I mean, you know, they but mostly through other practitioners and my own work, and just looking at, you know, many labs. I have the good fortune of seeing tons and tons of these because I do consulting for other practitioners as well. So sometimes, you know, I'll see the ones from my own clients, and then I'll see the ones from, you know, 10 other people's clients in a week as well. So you start to see patterns really fast.
So for example, if you work with a client and retest and that bifido number comes way up, then they're also having less symptoms or having better bowel movements. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And I know one of the things, I don't know how worth it is to go into how to read these numbers, but just for the bifidobacterium, for example, you see that 4.7 compared to a 1.1, that looks high, but that E8 stands for times 10 to the 8th power. So I'm looking at these powers of 10, you know, so you're talking about adding 8 zeros to the end here. So I'm looking at these powers of 10 in terms of where I'm looking for things to be in the optimal range, rather than these preceding numbers there. They don't really mean much in that context when you start adding zeros to the end of them.
Okay.
So, yep. Somebody just asked if
here?
I explained E8. I think I explained that. That's times 10 to the 8th power.
So for example, this could be 4.7 e to the 10th, and then you're like, oh, that's a lot higher. Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to keep going to these opportunistic?
Yep. Okay. So now this lab is showing us a whole lot of opportunistic bacteria. Some of them you can see are potential autoimmune triggering bacteria. Some are additional dysbiotic bacteria. So that just means imbalanced, abnormal bacteria that we don't want there. Not necessarily autoimmune triggering like the 1, 2, 3, 4 that we have under the autoimmune triggering ones. So with these, what we want to see, you see how the Citrobacter is showing that less than DL, that stands for detectable limit. And that's what we want to see, all of these opportunistic bacteria at less than the detectable limit. So this client has 5 that are actually within the labs where the lab starts flagging them all as high. And you see the Klebsiella is not so high that the lab's flagging it, but to me, I want to see that at the less than detectable limit. So we actually have 6 different bacteria, undesirable, unfriendly bacteria present growing out here. So these guys are crowding out her beneficial bacteria and kind of overgrowing, and we don't want them there at all. And so that can lead to a lot of GI problems, the constipation, the bloating, the discomfort, the poor nutrition, poor absorption, you know, affecting her nutrient status. All those kinds of things could be direct results of all these bacteria. And she's got the H. pylori. So this is kind of already like a double, triple whammy, right? Or I don't know what's like 6 to 6 times whammy. So yeah, she's got a lot. This is a pretty messy gut here.
Do you want to talk about that, how it says potential autoimmune triggers?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So some of these bacteria are associated with particular types of autoimmune conditions, but most of the time it's not so specific. These Proteus species, which she is having flagged as high, have been shown. There have been some research studies showing a relationship between that and rheumatoid arthritis. So what that suggests is not that everybody who has overgrowth of these Proteus species will develop rheumatoid arthritis, but that most people with rheumatoid arthritis have overgrowth of these Proteus species. Okay, so it's important, I think, to put that out there. But a lot of times I'll also see some of these triggering Hashimoto's, for example, which is so common in our kind of client base. Thyroid conditions, Hashimoto's, moving towards Hashimoto's. And, you know, sometimes other autoimmune conditions too. So sometimes if you start to clear up these bacteria, sometimes you can start to see antibody levels for autoimmune conditions start to come down as well, which is a really wonderful benefit of starting to deal with some of these things. We have somebody asking, so do you go with antibiotics for these out-of-whack bacteria? I'm guessing that's not the first step. That's not our first step.
And we're not doctors, so we can't prescribe those.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, depending on what I see, there are just a few things that if I see them on a test like this, that I will actually recommend somebody go to their medical doctor and get a prescription for antibiotics or get properly diagnosed and treated. For most of these things, and I always say to people, you know, of course, always check in with your doctor. Make sure that you are, you know, anything we're presenting here is sort of educational, really. I see myself primarily as an educator, and I help people to understand what's going on with their health and kind of from a different perspective and what some other options that they have. But ultimately, it's up to them to decide, you know, how they go about that. So we have people asking, how do you treat H. pylori? What's the cost of the GI map test? I don't know if we want to go into all of that right here. There are several, and this always depends on the person. And again, like sometimes it's more appropriate to have a doctor do actual treatment. Most of the time I'm talking about certain types of herbs and supplements that we can use that have some proven efficacy against these things. And then I have people what I would call right? So they're treating themselves based on the education that we provide them with. I think it's important to make that distinction here.
Yeah, and we can see here in this proteus it's E to the 5th, so it's quite a bit higher. So that's interesting to note. And yeah, as I said earlier, we don't sell these tests a la carte, but we also don't charge any more than we pay for them when you're in our program. So it's just part of the program, and basically because everybody's a little different, you pay for the service end, so to speak, the coaching end, and then we take care of ordering and interpreting and developing a protocol for you. Right. I think that our wholesale cost of a GI mass is $325.
It's $359. $359, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a little. But yeah, it would always be only if we recommend it based on your history taking. Yeah, I would really recommend, and I'll try to share the links with you later. We have 2 podcasts coming up, one with Ann and I. There won't be any audio errors because it's pre-recorded.
That one was very good.
That's really the nice thing about podcasting is that it's not live. We have one with Ann and I just explaining about patterns and cases, and then we have one that I mentioned earlier that's case review, and you get a sense of like when we decide to run what. And we also, when Ann and I talk in the podcast, you know, sometimes beyond this, Ann will run a SIBO test because she sees that, you know, it's indicated. But yeah, you're getting a sense that this is really interesting. It is really interesting. And this particular test I wrote about in my blog this week is very, revealing. Like I've had 2 other stool tests in my past. One just showed some bacterial imbalance. The other did show H. pylori, which I treated without any improvement in my gut symptoms at all. So it's not just one trigger, right? It's a bunch of stuff.
Right, which is why I don't want to answer that question of how would you treat H. pylori, because that's not the approach that I take. You know, that's a very kind of traditional medical approach, is you give X for Y. But our approach is more like, okay, how do I look at this whole person and all of the various things that are going on and take a unique, customized, catered approach to that person and their situation and their particular needs, rather than just saying, oh, I have this protocol for this, right?
Yeah, not to shut down the person who's asking this. It's a great, valid question. Of course, you're curious how we treat it.
Right.
And we just have a few options. And some people will work with their doctor to get antibiotics. There's pros and cons. And yeah, I really like this test. You know, my basic explanation of it is it looks for the DNA of these various species. And so it can catch things that aren't in large, like physical amounts in the stool, but you know, they're just in small amounts. They actually can like magnify the DNA, like replicate it and then test for it. So even though there's certainly not, I'm just going to scroll down, there's certainly not every parasite, you know, there's hundreds of parasites. So they're not testing everything, but they, you know, it was the best, in short, it was the best test I've ever had. And it found things that had never been found before, despite 2 stool tests that cost me plenty of money. And just, you know, this is years, you know, that I've lost, so to speak, to now just finally be treating, I think this is my parasite, right? This diacetyl. Yeah, we're treating this little guy right now. So yeah, it's a great test, and it's, you know, it's not cheap, but I think it's a great value, honestly, for what you get out of it, because yeah, like I said, I've had other tests that it didn't really move me forward, and this is the most optimistic I've ever felt seeing this test and being able to retest with this test. So this client was negative for parasites, but then looky here, very high for Candida. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. So Candida, I think a lot of people probably are familiar with that. You know, it's a yeast it's very common. And a lot of people are tuned into the fact that a lot of people have yeast overgrowth. And, you know, you probably, if you've been paying attention to podcasts like Bridget's and all of that, you've probably come across Candida at some point and some people talking about it. And the issue with Candida is there's so much information out about it and ways to try to dial back Candida, to get rid of Candida, really restrictive diets you can do. But it's so often secondary to a lot of these other types of infections, like the ones that we're seeing here, H. pylori, parasites. She doesn't have parasites, but a lot of people do. Bacterial dysbiosis and overgrowth, right? So Candida is an opportunistic yeast. So it will take hold where it can, and that's usually in a compromised environment. So sometimes it's a primary issue. And in her case, it's definitely, another thing that we'll need to deal with. Oftentimes I'll sort of sequence what I do based upon what seems to be more primary, what the most primary infection seems to be, and kind of try to target that first. Because Candida and even the geotrichum, which we see also showing up there, when the lab says low, that just means low levels of detected amounts. We want it to be negative. So it's similar to Candida, the geotrichum. And they're probably just growing and sort of feeding off of being in this environment that's really favorable to their growth and well-being. Not her growth and well-being so much, but their own. And so, she could probably try to address Candida first. And actually I think she had tried to. She was sort of aware that Candida was an issue. And oftentimes people will experience benefit from that, they do 60-day Candida protocol, they start to feel well, and a couple of months they're kind of right back in the same place where they were initially. And that's usually because there's a more primary infection there. And so the environment hasn't really been shifted enough to allow for the Candida to remain gone, right? It just kind of reestablishes itself.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Let's see what else we see here. I think this is the last page, so we can you.
Yep, lots of stuff here. So the elastase indicates that there's poor production of pancreatic enzymes. So those are the enzymes that'll help you to break down foods so that you can kind of absorb them and assimilate the nutrients from them. If you don't have enough enzymes, you're just not going to break your foods down into their smallest particles, into their nutrient-sized particles. So that's what enzymes do. They kind of break apart bigger molecules. So if they're not being broken apart, they're not going to be in the form that the body recognizes them in. And then a couple of things can happen. Either the body will flush them out and you just don't get the benefit at all of the foods that you've eaten. Or if you have more of a leaky gut situation, sometimes those larger molecules will just pass right through into the bloodstream, but the body has no idea what to do with them because they're not in a form that the body recognizes or uses. So this would, for this client in particular, I see this a lot on these GI maps, but for this client, and we see also the poor nutrient status, this is most certainly a factor in that.
Okay. And then let's look at this IgA, and can you explain what that is?
Yep. So Secretory Iga it's kind of the primary part of the immune system that responds in the gut. So your immune system comes online to try to deal with and discern, okay, here, this is some sort of pathogen that's coming through. We want to fight against that. This is something good that we want to allow through. So this is sort of like your immune system component of the gut. And so, every time we put food in our mouths, we're potentially exposing ourselves to any number of different bacteria and pathogens and yeasts and whatever that we could be ingesting through that. If Secretory Iga is strong enough and the gut is strong enough, in a lot of cases, it can just deal with whatever it's exposed to. But when Secretory Iga is low, it's usually an indicator that the system overall, the immune system, is also not up to the task anymore. So again, we see this deficiency in this particular client.
Okay. Go ahead.
The anti-gliadin IgA is your gluten indicator. So she's very, very gluten sensitive also. We see that marker really high. So, she was eating a lot of grains. She was eating a lot of gluten-containing grains. She was trying to do a good job with it. She was trying to eat, sprouted breads and all that kind of thing. But she's highly reactive. And so that's going to create a lot of inflammation, and that's going to trigger the immune system. And when the immune system's been trying to fight something for a long time, it becomes tired, like anything does, right? If it's just kind of always on. So this could be, an initial factor for her going way back, that the gluten sensitivity has been a trigger for some of these other things that have allowed the gut to become more inflamed and compromised.
Okay. And then let's look at the last high marker, the beta glucuronidase there at the bottom. That's a newer result, right?
Yeah, and this is interesting to see this high on her. So in clients with really elevated, sometimes this marker will drive estrogens high, actually. Usually I don't see it influencing estrogen levels on the Dutch test till this beta glucuronidase gets to the 3000s, 4000s kind of range. But what typically, this is also an enzyme, but what this enzyme does is it interferes with detoxification. So there are a couple things that have to happen in the detoxification process, especially for things like hormones. So hormones are fat soluble. But in order for the liver to detoxify things, they have to become water soluble. So part of phase 1 detoxification is often to turn fat soluble substances into water soluble substances. So for hormones, they'll attach a glucuronic acid molecule. What this enzyme does is it breaks that bond between the glucuronic acid and the hormone. So then you wind up being unable to detoxify your hormones properly. And beta glucuronidase is usually produced specifically by dysbiotic opportunistic bacteria. So we do have one client, that's not the case with this one, but we have one client who has beta glucuronidase levels that are about 4,400, and she's one with really high estrogen levels on her Dutch test. So that's what as the beta glucuronidase gets higher, in some ways you could think about it, well, that might be a good thing for this client, but you don't really want this to be the way that the body's producing or keeping estrogen around. You still want detoxification to be occurring properly. But in her case, we probably just want to support more production of estrogen.
Okay. It's interesting that you're getting to know these trends, because I think I last talked to you a couple of months ago and you're like, I'm not sure about this yet. And now you're like, okay, well, now I know, 3,000 or 4,000 is when things start to show.
Yeah. So we have one more question that just came through, and she asked, is this a test that can be done at home and sent in? Yes. So when we order these labs, you get a kit that gets drop shipped to your house, and then it's an at-home collection, and there will be all the information inside for shipping and all of that. So you don't have to go to a lab or a location or anything to collect the samples, fortunately, right?
Yeah, both of these. The Dutch test is super easy to do internationally. It's such a tiny, tiny package. It's like a letter package. Let me put my video back on here. I think the stool test we have just one client that we couldn't get the stool test.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so we found a different one for her, and she's not in America. So sometimes if you're in another country, it can be more challenging, but there are other options out there. So.
Yeah. Anne's done a great job of figuring out solutions for our international clients. We have a number of expats in our program right now. I don't know why. I don't know if that'll continue. But we've done a pretty good job of accommodating them. So again, I really apologize for the technical. I feel like there's just like a series of errors and bad decisions with this live technical event. But I will send the results if you want to look at them. If we need to do something else, we could pre-record a webinar or do something else. But I hope people got the gist of it. I know it's frustrating when this is like new information and you're not quite keeping up. But we can take more questions now if you like. And maybe while anyone jots down questions, I'll just share a bit more that, if for your own health case, and even if you are a healthcare practitioner, we have a few who are our clients. This is a new world for many people getting these kind of tests run and these protocols. And we're just talking about 2 tests. There's, a handful or more of other tests that we run as needed. I mentioned for SIBO. I mentioned, we do some nutrients testing, some thyroid testing. We've done some food sensitivity testing, food allergy testing. And I've had one client tested for mold toxins. So it's just case by case, it's very specific, and we can get most things ordered for you. Occasionally you can get something run by your doctor. You cannot get these 2 tests run by your doctor because they're just outside, of the standard medical system. The best way to get some things covered is if you have a health savings account or a flexible spending plan. That's your best bet. I think there's 1 or 2 tests, the nutrient test, they'll try to bill your insurance for you. But our general concept is like, we can't promise you'll be covered. So that's, we just sort of start with that. And do you want to put your video back on?
Sure. Yeah, we'll try it and see.
We don't have to if you feel like it was
wobbly. I'll try it. We'll see how it goes. Okay.
Hey.
Do you see me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to take this question from Lydia, and then we got a lot of questions. Maybe you can read them over, Anna. I'll take this one from Lydia. Best food sensitivity test or mold testing? Well, Anne can weigh in too, but for mold testing, my personal preferences would be to test the dust in your home. I forget the company I use, but I can maybe look it up while Anne's talking later. You can test your body, your urine, but it's pretty expensive and it can give you a false negative. And then I like to test for an infection in your nose called Marcons. That's what we tested on our one client. When you have mold, or it could be other things too, or suppressing your immune system for a long time, you can get this buildup of a staph infection in your nose, and then that further dysregulates actually your melatonin production that we talked about earlier, which you really need. So I really like that nose test. It's really easy I like the home dust test. You can test again your urine, and we can order it. I think it's real-time lab, so we could order it for you, but I try to be conscious of people's budgets, and if people are like, no, I really want that, you can have it. But those are the mold ones. And then the food sensitivity, I like that MRT test. It's like a test for an inflammatory reaction to food, but I know, Anne, you don't always love it the best. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, I think that food sensitivity testing is sort of a tricky thing in general. I've been running the Cyrix Array 10 a lot more frequently these days. But I think there are kind of benefits, there are pros and cons to a lot of them. And I know, Bridget, that you had a lot of good clinical results by using the MRT test. And I think that's been the case for a lot of people too. So I think that the Cyrix Array 10 tends to be more accurate.
Okay.
But
I defer to you because you're in this world more. I know we did run that on one client, and she had a lot of positives, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, again, like a multi-factor thing, right? That means just her gut is really reacting. Her gut health is weak. We have a lot of questions, and I appreciate it. I'm going to take as many as I can because we got off to a rocky start here. So I'll make up for it. And Anne, I don't know if you have to get going. It's late where you are.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer.
Let's see what other
Cindy.
ones.
So Cindy's saying she's waiting for results from doing an organic acids test. Would the Dutch test or GI test be worthwhile to do as well, or is there a lot of overlap? There is not a lot of overlap. The organic acids test will have some indicators of dysbiotic bacteria and yeast and that kind of thing. But you don't really know specifically what kinds of bacteria are showing up and if there are any kind of parasitic infections that you might want to deal with first. So a lot of times I think organic acids tests are great pointer tests. They kind of say, hey, you might want to look at heavy metals. Hey, you might want to look at more in depth at a stool test. Hey, you might want to look at hormones or neurotransmitters, but it doesn't give you a whole lot of specifics. So I see it sort of like this kitchen sink, get a big view kind of test. But when you want to drill down a little bit more, things like the Dutch test and the GI map. So they could definitely round out an organic acids test for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get these as the last one for you, Anne. Valada asked, is there a difference between that CAGA and VACA virulence factors when we're looking at the H. pylori?
There are differences. There are some very, very dry scientific journal peer-reviewed published articles out there on these. I don't have a general sense of exactly the differences between the two. And I think that the big takeaway anyway is that when either or both of those are positive, it does indicate that the H. pylori is likely to be a more problematic strain that could lead to even more damage. I mean, I think H. pylori on its own is a pretty, most of the time, a pretty damaging bacteria anyway, especially if somebody's clinically presenting with symptoms. But if you have those virulence factors, it's definitely a warning sign, and there are, I think, a lot more potential detrimental things that could occur down the line if you don't treat it when you do have those virulence factors present. So some of the things I talked about, ulcers, even cancer. That kind of thing,
so not a big clinical difference as far as how you treat, it sounds
right.
like.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Annette asked if use of antihistamines would skew the Dutch test. Anne's nodding. We generally give a list of things to get off of before you run either one of these tests. I didn't know as much about the antihistamines. I know that for women's health, those skew things. What are your thoughts, Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely see antihistamines having an impact on cortisol levels. Yeah, there are typically we would recommend, if possible, I mean, if you're taking medication provided, and this is something like for each individual that's part of the intake, sort of looking at if you're taking certain kinds of medications, I would never even think to suggest to tell you if you're on a prescribed medication that you should stop taking it. If you're taking some over-the-counter things, then I have a conversation with you about how necessary that, if you can come off of it for a week prior, and there are some things it's fine to keep taking, and there are other things that, the test results can be skewed by any number of different things, supplements, vitamins. Okay.
Yeah. And sometimes we just say, the instructor, you and I both, like, if you feel like you're going to not do well to get off of something, sometimes we just have you stay on it, and we just kind of factor that into the results as we look at them. So, Anne, I'm going to take a few more questions, but if you need to hop off, you can. And okay. Okay.
One. And thank you, Bridget.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
All right, I'll just take these out. So Lulu asked if we're going to do a training program. Yeah, we are going to do a training program. It's cooking on the back burner for 2018 to do something. So I did put out a survey recently, and maybe I should put it out again in our Facebook group just to see what services people are the most interested in who are clinicians. So Lulu, you're welcome if you didn't fill that out to look for that survey in our last few newsletters, and maybe I'll post it on the Facebook group. So yeah, this is really interesting stuff, and we want to teach it. It's just a matter of getting it all organized into a cohesive fashion. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. And then let's see, Amy asked if there's a functional test panel that tests for EBV, HHV, is that herpes? Maybe, I'm not sure. EBV is a blood test, and when I've had it through some naturopaths I think that we could order it for a client, because the most blood tests you can get like through a patient portal nowadays, and you just get it drawn in your area. The EBV test, I think, is a little bit hard to interpret, much like we learned about today, because there's some markers that will show an acute versus chronic infection, like you have been exposed, you're being re-exposed. So I think there's a little bit of subtlety in how you interpret that, but I think that those are all blood tests. And then, just looking at it from a more functional standpoint. Judy asks, she suspected a return of Candida. She's on caprylic acid for several months. She planned to do a Dutch test, but customer service told me I had to wait until after I'm done the caprylic acid. Can I do this test now or wait? I'm not sure how the caprylic acid affects your hormones, but I would defer to Dutch because I think they know best their tests. But Judy, if you're doing it to suppress symptoms and you're doing it for months at a time, that's a long time. So I would say ultimately, and if I were to work with it, it wouldn't be my ideal way to work with Candida, is just to continually suppress it for months at a time. I'd probably have a different approach. So I would defer to Dutch about whether or not you can take the caprylic acid. I just wonder if you'd be a good candidate for a GI map. I don't know how strong your Candida is, but if you can, usually for the GI map, we'll have you get off everything that's sort of killing and suppressing bugs in your body, because that's going to give a false result. So if that seems something between your practitioner or, if you work with us that you think you could handle, then we take you off. Candida is very opportunistic secondary infection. It's linked to so many things: heavy metals, Epstein-Barr, mold. So it's never coming alone. It's always coming with friends. So that's why Anne mentioned earlier, so many Candida protocols don't work. So I hope that helps a little bit, but yeah, I'm not sure why the Dutch test told you, but they must have some experience thinking that skews the results. Usually when you fill out a Dutch test, you write down what supplements you're on. So maybe they've noticed some trends, or maybe they know something about the mechanism of that I don't know. Angelica asks, if you have irregular periods, how do you make sure the Dutch test is on the right day? That is a great question. I'm really glad you asked that. So there's a couple ways to do a Dutch test. One is to do a one-day test, and another is to do a month-long test. If you are still a cycling woman, but you're irregular, one way you could do it is to take an ovulation predictor kit, and then when you ovulated, even if it was late or early, and then you want to do it like about 5 or 6 days after you ovulate. So that's one way to do it. Another, if you're irregular, you may want a month-long test to figure out why you're irregular. So Dutch test is, for men, just only one snapshot. For women who are cycling, usually day 20-ish, and then for women who are postmenopausal, kind of any day. So if you're irregular or your period's just missing in action, you can do one. If it's missing in action, you probably just have to do one day, any day, because you don't even know when you're starting. But if you're irregular, you just have a 40 day or 20 day, you can still test the month long. And I think it's worthwhile because you can see, did you not ovulate? How did your hormones spike? We've seen some pretty interesting things with the month long, with different spikes and that kind of thing. So just a little bit depending, Angelica, on your particular case and what your goals are. Like if your goals are to get pregnant, or if you're close to menopause, that might be a different goal, and you might not need a whole long month. Facebook group. We have 2 Facebook groups. One is Women's Wellness Radio Fan Club. And then there's one that's for practitioners. You are a practitioner, called Women's Wellness Collaborators. So that's the noun, collaborators. If I have a time, I can send you those links. Angelica, the GI map is the second stool test we looked at together today. Could it be irregular because of perimenopause? Absolutely. Fibroids, it could be. It could be because fibroids, there's usually estrogen dominance, so things could be off from that too. So, we within our domain, we don't diagnose things like fibroids, but the way we treat can help things like fibroids. And then you can also see your gynecologist, as needed if you suspect fibroids. It's great to get that kind of care. Sometimes I've seen over time clients shun the conventional medicine system at their detriment because they missed something that could have been found a long time ago on a scan, that kind of a thing. So sometimes it's good to integrate. Great. Well, I apologize for the technical errors in the beginning. I was just felt like it didn't quite go. So thank you for those of you who stuck around. And I will send the 2 examples if you want to see them that we used today. And just, reach out to me if you're like, I didn't really catch that, or, just give me your feedback if we need to do something over or that kind of a thing. Yeah, Rachel will send the replay for sure tonight, and I'll send the 2 documents. And Marcia asked, can you do a Dutch on teenagers? Yeah, I think that they recommend that you've had your period at least for a few years before you run one, because your first few years are pretty unstable, and that's kind of like typical. But yeah, we have a 15 or 16-year-old in the program right now. So we like working with younger women. It's often the mom who's finding us. But it's really interesting, and what a great gift to like start out in life like on the right foot. Most of us didn't get that kind of good care when we were young women. So great. Thank you, ladies. Thank you for your patience. If you enjoy nerding out on labs, hopefully it was worth sticking around. And I will send, let's see. I'll send this. I'll share this link as well. This is where you can get a Spark case review. And I think I'll send you, just stay tuned. I'm going to send you some other goodies for those who signed up for this webinar. So just stay tuned. And I'll include the Facebook pages. Good idea. in the replay email that's going to go out in a little bit. So thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate it. And to those of you who are practitioners, stay tuned. We'll keep training you. Honestly, if you're a practitioner, one of the best ways to start learning is to get this done on yourself, right? Because if you haven't actually gone through it yourself, going through it yourself is like so powerful. Even if you go on to study it, you'll pretty much have to do it yourself. So this kind of gets you a jump start to say, how did that Dutch test help me? How did that GI map influence my health? So it's a great way to start is to do a program with us, and you won't be the first. It's not saying anything's wrong if you haven't figured out your own health. We all work with other practitioners. So would love to have you. Thanks, everyone. Bye, Paula, Lydia, Annette, Rosalie, Marilyn, Amy, Judy, Dominique, Jan. Where do I find your podcast? Okay, I will share that too. Podcast link, Rachel, Marcia. Thank you, Lulu, Walada. I hope I say your name right. Cindy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.